Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week we're going to take a hard look at the latest GDP numbers released by the CSO on 31st May 2016. What do these numbers really signify? Has the economy bottomed out? Are we well and truly on the path to recovery? Or as in the past, will it be a case of flattering to deceive? And to pass the numbers threadbare for you, I have with me a panel of eminent economists. So let me welcome to the show Dr. C. Rangarajan, who has worn so many hats in his long and distinguished career that it's difficult to zero in on any one to describe him. He's been Governor RBI, Chairman PM Economic Advisory Council, Member Planning Commission, so I'll just leave it at that. I also have with me Saumitra Chaudhuri, former Member Planning Commission, and Ananth Narayan, Managing Director and Regional Head of Global Markets, Standard Chartered Bank. Welcome to the show. Let me start by asking each of you, what is your broad takeaway from the latest numbers? Do you see the glass as half full or half empty? Do these set at rest all the doubts we had about the recovery story, or do niggling doubts remain? We'll get into the details a little later, but first let me have your initial reaction and why. Let me start with you, Dr. Rangarajan.
The headline numbers relating to the growth rate of the last quarter at 7.9%. and for the year as a whole at 7.6% are very respectable. It is all the more so in the context of the uncertain global situation. Therefore, in one sense, these numbers are satisfactory and satisfying. Of course, there are concerns about the way in which the numbers have been generated. There are concerns about the credibility of some of the numbers that come out. Even as they are, there are also some issues that arise. All that one can say is certainly 2015-16 seems to have been better than the previous year. But the numbers also indicate that except for two sectors like agriculture and manufacturing, in all the other sectors, the growth rate for the 15-16 is lower than 14-15. So one has to see what that implies. Going ahead, one can say perhaps with an improvement in agriculture because of the normal monsoon, the economy may see a better picture in the fiscal 16-17. But at the same time, I would say, as we shall have the opportunity to elaborate later, some important concerns, particularly relating to the behavior of investment.
Okay. So spoken like a true economist, respectable, satisfactory, satisfying, but Dr. Rangarajan still has some concerns, which he said he'll elaborate later and just touched upon right now. Saumitra, would you second that opinion, or would you have a different take altogether on the numbers?
You know, Mythili, you started by talking about a glass half full or glass half empty. We shall say, is this a glass I see before me? I mean, there are issues of a variety of issues in the news series. There are issues relating to the growth rates that have been computed. There are issues relating to the magnitudes. The average overall magnitude of GDP hasn't changed very much. But if you were to look at that series in terms of broad sectors, there are major changes. And really don't know. I believe the CSO is constructing a back series. Maybe we'll know more once that is out. Now, coming to the rates of growth. Yes, as Dr. Rangarajan says, 7.9% by our metric of what used to be considered to good growth in the past is strong growth. But, you know, how do we sort of make sense out of it? If you look at 2015-16 numbers, in the first half of the year, industry actually was not doing so badly. Industry is doing quite well, in fact. And the 3-month moving average of the IIP, which all is false, etc., the IIP was over 4%, average was around 4.5% of GDP in the first 4.5% over the first 6 months of 2015-16. Now that translated to a GDP number in the first half average of 8.2%. I can live with that because we know the IIP does underestimate growth. In the second half, IIP for manufacturing, the 3-month moving average was 0%. And we've got, what do you have in average growth? 9.3%. Now, maybe this is a new reality. This is, as you know.
We'll come to the internals a little later, Saumitra, but I get your point that you're very skeptical of the numbers. But Anantha, if Dr. Rangarajan was just a little cautious in his reaction, clearly Saumitra is far more skeptical of the numbers. How do you read them? Are you somewhere in between? Saumitra said he's not sure that it's a glass at all. Maybe it's a prism. What is your reaction to the numbers, Ananth?
Well, Mythili, I'm just a lowly market participant, and I'm no way as erudite as either Dr. Chaudhuri or Dr. Rangarajan. But I'll give you the market perspective of what strikes us immediately when we see these numbers. 3 points that stick out for me. One is the fact that the discrepancy number seems to be inordinately large. At least my economist tells me that if it was not for this category of discrepancies, the GDP number would have been far lower at 5.2%. The second one, which is kind of bewildering, is the fact that personal consumption seems to have gone up quite sharply at 7.2%. Now, given that a bulk of consumption is also rural, where clearly the demand seems to be on the lower side, these numbers simply don't tie up with what we sense is the actual truth on the ground. The third worrisome number, I guess, or the component, is the investment story. And as both Dr. Chaudhuri and Dr. Rangarajan pointed out, we seem to have a situation where investment is really tepid, which is kind of scary. We have a mix where consumption is doing far better than investment. And for the first time, we've seen, in many years, we've seen gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP going below 30%, which is not a good sign at all for a country that is so starved of investments. All in all, I think, Mythili, the bewilderment of the market with the data which comes out in GDP continues. We will continue to, kind of ignore it possibly and look at more fast-moving IIP, results from the companies and so on and so forth. But the niggling fear at the back of our mind is if we continue to ignore it, how long can the RBI continue to ignore it? What does it mean for policy, for RBI, especially if consumption is showing a strong trend? And secondly, maybe the GDP number is showing us something that is actually true, and because we've been crying wolf for so long, we're going to ignore it, which is again a scary thought.
So clearly this is what happens if you have three practitioners of the dismal science and you put them together. The one, of course, says he's a market practitioner, but he seems to have the traits of an economist. But Dr. Rangarajan, if you want to turn to the internals, what is your assessment? Do the sectoral growth rates tell you a different and perhaps a happier story? Or do the internals also give you reason for disquiet? And here I'd like to talk about a very specific sector, manufacturing, where we have so much riding on the revival of the sector, not just for the success of the government's Make in India program, but also to ensure jobs for our youngsters. Is the growth rate of 9.3% in manufacturing in Q4 a happy augury? Or should we be concerned, since it's quite at odds with what the index of industrial production seems to tell us, even if we accept that part of the difference is on account of the different ways in which they are measured? The IIB measures growth in volume terms, while the GDP numbers are in terms of value add. But yes, the disconnect seems much more than is warranted. Dr. Rangarajan?
Well, the disturbing, or shall I say, the unexplained part of the whole set of numbers is the factors behind the sharply increasing growth rate in manufacturing. For example, for 2014-15, the manufacturing growth rate was put at 5.5%, and it has gone up to 9.3%. It is this which in fact makes a big difference between the overall growth rate in the previous year and in the in 2015-16. The only explanation that is being offered in the report is that 69% of the manufacturing is coming from the corporate sector, and only the balance from the other sectors. And they have therefore taken the corporate results as a basis for estimating the manufacturing growth rate for 69%. Now this really becomes very difficult to digest completely. As you said, the index of industrial production, particularly manufacturing, has not grown that well, apart from the fact that Saumitra mentioned about the disparity between the first half and the second half. So the growth rate is only about 2% as far as manufacturing is concerned over the year, and we get a growth rate of 9.3%. Another intriguing factor, actually the manufacturing growth rate in 2014-15 was 2.3% according to the index of industrial production, but the value added growth rate was 5.5%. In 2015-16, the manufacturing growth rate according to industrial production came down, but in the case of value added, it had gone up by 9.3%.
But Saumitra, till some years ago, there was talk of India leapfrogging into the post-industrial stage thanks to the strong growth in services. And now increasingly we are realizing that there are no shortcuts. India cannot be an outlier to the traditional model of economic growth and will have to focus on more broad-based growth across sectors, not services alone. So is the services-led growth story over, or is there still some life in it? And how advisable is it to go that way?
I think you need to grow in every sector. There is no way that we will do services, somebody else will do manufacturing, will import all our requirements. This is non-starter. This, I think, was a vacuous argument in the first place. But coming back to internals, Dr. Rangarajan, of course, has correctly underlined the issues and discomfort that people have with the GDP and the other metrics for the manufacturing sector. But let me point out something which is rather strange. If you look at the trade, hotels, restaurants, repair, communications and storage, the large sector accounting for about 18% of GDP, and you look at finance, real estate and business, another 10% of GDP, that's almost 1/3 of GDP. Typically, the issue with the manufacturing sector, according to the CSO, is they're taking the current price growth, which is about 7%, and then they got deflator, which is negative, and they get this number. Now, in the services sector, however, the current price growth rate is half that, or 50% less than the growth rate in constant prices, which means the deflator is negative there too. Now, this doesn't, I find it difficult to understand.
Many mysteries in services, mysteries in manufacturing. But now let me turn to agriculture. Ananth, agriculture is not a sector that really enthuses many macroeconomists in India, unfortunately. And foreign banks in particular have very little to do with agriculture. Nonetheless, I would like to ask you to throw light on something that is a bit of a puzzle. The share of agriculture in GDP has shrunk over the years. And the growth rate too has lagged other sectors. At the same time, there seems to be a very strong correlation between agricultural growth and overall growth. So given the higher growth rate that we expect in agriculture this year, thanks to a good monsoon, can we hope for an 8% plus growth next year?
Oh, absolutely. So look, Mythili, while agriculture as a share of GDP is clearly pretty low at 14 or 15%, the reality is the number of people whose livelihoods are linked to agriculture is unfortunately pretty high. It's over 50%, 55% if I remember the statistics right. So what we see as rural demand, which can range between 35 to 50% of overall private demand in the country, clearly depends upon the fortunes on agriculture. And the fact that the last 2 years have seen a well below average monsoon clearly have impacted that very, very important segment of rural demand. Now, we are hoping for a reversal now. We have a La Nina rather than a El Nino. And, we've never had 3 bad monsoons in a row for a long time. So we are hoping that trend reverses. And that should bring some welcome relief to the rural households. In fact, one statistic worth noting is that at one point of time, I think 2011-12, we actually had rural demand growing at twice urban demand. And today it looks like rural demand is going well below urban demand. If at all there is any story on consumption, it's probably from the urban sectors rather than from rural. And also from a perspective of more equitable growth, I think it's extremely important that agriculture shows some respite, and therefore the folk in the rural countryside see some fillip. I think the other thing which could lead to a bit of a consumption growth, of course, is the arrears on the pay commission whenever the government decides to allocate that, and that will probably come with a January 1st, 2016 back value. So that could see a bit of fillip on the consumption side as well. But to your original question, I think agriculture, while foreign bankers like us, you could argue, don't really bother about it, actually we do, because clearly the state of consumption in the country depends upon a lot on agriculture.
So there are mysteries in services, manufacturing and agriculture, something that we really need to pay attention to. But I'm afraid on that note, it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we are trying to unravel the mysteries that lie behind the latest CSO numbers, which seem to show that the economy is doing very, very well. Dr. Rangarajan, key to growth revival really is a pickup in investment. Do you see that happening? And if not, why not? And can government continue to invest? And should it do so even if it means breaching the fiscal deficit target? And is that this unstated aim of setting up an expert committee to review the FRBM Act in order to provide some sanctity to a breach if it required?
The economy seems to be on a mend. I mean, it seems to be recovering. The recovery is not that strong as indicated by the headline numbers. But one thing which you mentioned earlier and to which I would go back is about the investment rate in the Indian economy. Leave aside the high investment rate that we had in 2007-8. Even in the more recent period, if you take, even according to the revised series, the gross capital formation rate has been steadily declining from 2013-14, whether you measure it in terms of constant prices or whether you measure the ratio in terms of current prices. There is a decline in the gross fixed capital formation rate by almost 2 percentage points in the last 3 years. Now, growth sometimes can happen without a pickup in investment rate. That is, when there is excess capacity, the pickup in demand can lead to better utilization of capacity and the growth can come out of it. But if you need employment also, I think it cannot come just because of the better utilization of capacity. It is only new investment that can generate more employment.
Ananth, almost everybody has agreed, and Dr. Rangarajan also talked about the importance of investment, but that can happen only if domestic savings increase. And what we have seen is that domestic savings is more a function of the level of incomes rather than interest rate. So what do we do? How do we increase investment? Do we have to first increase in incomes and then investment? Which follows and which leads? Ananth?
Mythili, I have a slightly nuanced view to that. Yes, savings rates need to increase. At the same time, it's also a question of ensuring that savings are channeled towards investments, and that too especially productive investments. And I completely agree with Dr. Rangarajan. We can't have growth without employment being generated for multiple factors. Whether you're looking at employment, whether you're looking for macroeconomic stability in the form of current account deficit and fiscal deficit, if you're looking for even inflation. I think investments are very, very critical. We need investments into water management, into cold storages, into food logistics to bring down inflation, because a lot of the problems on inflation is supply side. We need manufacturing and employment to grow so that GDP grows as a whole and therefore brings down fiscal deficit and controls current account deficit. I think the one panacea we're looking for really is investments into productive infrastructure. This can sound strange at a time when capacity utilization is as low as it is, but the reality is the alleviation of a lot of the problems that dog us requires investments, and particularly into infrastructure. Now, the reality also is the capacity of the private sector to participate in this is quite low at the moment. Let's face it, we have stressed balance sheet amongst large corporates. We have stressed balance sheet amongst banks. The last 2 quarters have, with the AQR of the RBI, have only indicated that the problems are fairly deep-seated. Now, we need to come out of this morass, and clearly the government has to take a lead at a time when private sector capability is quite low. It is doing that, to be fair, in roads, in irrigation, in defense, in railways, a bunch of areas. But what we are hoping for is that this will segue eventually to the private sector as well, and that is still some way to come through. And I think a lot of things need to happen before the investment cycle can start all over again.
Saumitra, in our obsession with GDP numbers, we did talk about investment, but in our obsession with GDP numbers, are we really guilty of ignoring a very critical aspect of growth, jobs? How can we ensure that whatever growth we achieve, it comes in tandem with the maximum number of jobs possible? Else, this growth will just not be sustainable, whatever happens on the investment front.
I think if you put jobs ahead of the cart, you put it the wrong way around. You need to get growth. You need to get sustainable growth, and that creates jobs. You can't really target jobs. Jobs get created in comparatively low tech areas in a large way if you get growth at the top line, you will get jobs. But unfortunately, the growth in the top line is, what's happening is that if you get 2-3 good months, after that you get 2-3 very mediocre months. So there always seems to be some fizzle which is constantly draining out. I mean, look at electricity generation. I'll give you an instance, for instance. February was very good, March was very good, April was very good. And May, we are back to square one, 6.6%. This has happened time and time again. So you get 3 months good, 4 months not so good. So that's not where you're going to get a pickup. On the issue of capacity utilization, we know the capacity utilization is low across most industries, and therefore new capacity isn't going to come in a hurry. So therefore, if you're going to get private investment, not only you need healthy balance sheets, and if you look at the profit and loss accounts of the major corporates which are listed, you'd find as, for example, let's say total operating surplus, EBITDA, in nominal terms have more or less remained the same. It hasn't worsened, but it hasn't improved. There are companies with stressed balance sheets, and of course banks have got stressed balance sheets. So there's a situation where you got a weak demand on the one side, you got somewhat weakened capacity for it to invest on the private sector. And by the way, as far as public investment is concerned, I've just got 2 points to make. One is that in public investment, you can take a decision, but that happening on the ground takes time. The only 2 sectors that you can actually get investment once you take a decision is roads and PMGSY, and I think both those decisions have been taken. The second thing, what is the capacity of the government? The 7th Pay Commission, by the way, is going to make financing difficult for this government, even in this year. Last year, we got a huge growth from the additional duties on petroleum goods. That's not going to happen this year. So there's going to be a crunch towards the end. And when the crunch comes, deferrable expenditure is what really is that gets deferred, and very often it's things like roads won't happen, but PMGSY and a few other micro irrigation, they'll get slashed. So there are limits without improving domestic demand. I think that really is the crisis issue. Without improving domestic demand, both private and public, you aren't going to get out of it.
Absolutely. So the situation is far more complex than would seem at prima facie. Well, I started the show by asking each of you in turn for your initial reaction to the GDP numbers. And now before I close, I want to ask each of you another question. What do you think is our potential growth rate? Dr. Rangarajan, you recently wrote a piece where you estimated the potential growth rate at 8 to 9%. But most observers, including the RBI, where a recent staff paper estimated at just 6.7% for 2015, feel that post the global financial crisis, we'll have to settle for a lower potential growth rate. So what makes you more optimistic, or have you now revised your view?
Well, it all depends upon how you define potential rate of growth. To me, the potential rate of growth of the economy is the level at which an economy can go given the possible set of circumstances. We have shown for a period of 5 years between 2005-6 and 2010-11 that it is possible for the economy to grow at between 8 and 9%. That is a sustained growth over a 5-year period. It is not a flash in the pan. Therefore, to me, the potential rate of growth of the economy is a maximum rate of growth of the economy that the economy has shown in the past. Therefore, I still think it is 8 to 9%. But the potential rate of growth is not necessarily the rate of growth that you will see immediately. I personally think that without a substantial improvement in the investment ratio, you are not going to be able to pick up a very high growth. But certainly, the 7.6% rate of growth is, with all our reservations regarding the number, is a good growth rate, and therefore our ability to be able to grow perhaps at 7.8% given the present methodology in the coming year is a real possibility, because because agriculture should do well, even though its contribution may be only 18% to GDP, but there can be a substantial increase in agriculture. And if that also helps to generate a certain amount of demand in the economy, it will help. You asked, in fact, earlier one question about which comes first, growth or investment. It is really a chicken and egg situation. Because according to the acceleration principle of investment, it is the increase in growth which generates investment. Therefore, growth has to pick up in order to be able to create the conditions in which investment will come. Therefore, we have to break this. But I'm sure that given the current situation and given the better performance of agriculture or expected performance of agriculture in the coming year, we should move closer to 7.8 or 7.9% next year.
Well, I'm afraid we're completely out of time, so we'll have to end this discussion here with Dr. Rangarajan giving us that optimistic view that our potential is much higher, we can do very much better. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan, Ananth as well as Saumitra, for joining me in this discussion and sharing your views on what to make of the GDP numbers. I'm sure you've given our viewers a great deal of food for thought. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.